Alice, can you tell us a bit about this beautiful book, 100 Days, and why you wrote it?
Oh, so I wrote 100 Days in the same way I write all my books, not because I had this fully formed wisdom to impart to anyone, but because I was struggling with something that I wanted to delve deeper into, which was this idea of to what extent do our children belong to us, and to what extent do parents often subconsciously see their children as attachments to themselves. And so I set 100 Days in a world in which I was very familiar, commission flats in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And I set it specifically in the commission flats because there are restrictions there. And I thought, what would it be if you were a young person growing up in those flats and then you got pregnant and you're going to have a child, even though you were still a child yourself. So that's where the premise of 100 Days came from.
You talked about growing up in the 80s, and you set this book in the 80s, and as an editor I had a lot of fun looking up all of the references and making sure they were all the right time and so on. Can you tell me why you set it at that time? Why was it important to you to set it in the 80s?
Oh, it was so important just because I know the era well. But if you got pregnant at that time, you couldn't Google anything. Now you can Google, and not only do you have a wealth of advice from your local community, from doctors in Australia, but from all over the world, from America, from the UK, So you have many options because you have a wealth of information. Back in the 80s, everything was so local. If you got pregnant, you had to go to a library and borrow a book called What to Expect When You're Expecting. If that book wasn't on loan with a waiting list, and you were scared, you were terrified, so you might not want to borrow that book. You didn't want to ask your parents. So I wanted to show what it was like if you had limited information. How would you respond to a pregnancy?
So Karuna, she is such an interesting character. She's not kind of the standard sassy heroine or anything like that. She is quite prickly in a way, isn't she? And maybe a little bit cynical, but also quite naive because she is so cut off in a way. Can you tell us a bit about her and what you like about her and how she changes over the course of the book?
Oh, thanks, Jo. I like that word prickly because Karuna is essentially a bit of a loner because, as you mentioned, there's no mobile phones back then. She switched schools. Her mother keeps her very cloistered because she's the only child, and her mother is so proud of this precious half-white child. And one of the early reviewers said there's a lot of colorism in this book. I didn't grow up with that term, and in the 80s that term didn't exist, but that's exactly what it explains. A biracial child back then would have had a very distinct position in society, and they still do now. So she's quite alone and she's quite prickly because I didn't want to create a character that was a teen protagonist. When you do one of those characters, you're not really creating a character, you're picking a bunch of quirks that would be admirable and would be pro-feminist and creating a character like that. I wanted to create a real human being who was responding to quite restrictive circumstances in her life. So you don't develop a dynamic and Juno personality. You just a little bit moribund, a little bit depressed, a little bit prickly in those circumstances.
Yeah. There's a lot of cultural references in the book drawn from the time, but also drawn from fairy tales. Can you tell me a bit about what part fairy tales play in the story?
Oh, well, as you mentioned, Karuna is quite naive. And this was back in the 80s where fairy tales played a huge part. In fact, one of the most seminal films of that time was Labyrinth, which was a fairy tale about a princess who has to rescue a prince, so her little brother, and then in the meantime falls in love with David Bowie. Very strange twist in that fairy tale. So the very strange twist in Karuna's fairy tale is she is burgeoning with new life. But fairy tales play a huge part because she's just graduated from fairy tales, you know, and moved to a Catholic school, which is still quite a confined environment. Her best friend is very innocent, Greek girl named Tweezer, because her mum can't pronounce Teresa, so Tweezer stuck. And so it's the sense of innocence of the fairy tales, and also the compelling sense of darkness in them, which is what attracted me to weave them throughout this book.
That's really interesting.
The Grimm's fairy tales are really grim, hey?
They
And
are
children
dark.
died in them, and children got sold. And
Yeah. It's almost like you can't imagine reading them to little kids now. They're so
as they
dark.
were, yeah.